Clara Whitfield ran into a burning barn in the middle of the night with no weapon, no lantern, and no one coming to help her. She could hear the child screaming somewhere inside the smoke, and she didn't stop to think. She didn't stop to pray. She just ran. People in Broken Oak Valley would talk about that night for the rest of their lives. But what they never fully understood was this. Clara wasn't brave because she was fearless. She was brave because she had already lost everything once, and she refused to lose again. If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel right now, hit that notification bell and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's begin. The stagecoach pulled into Broken Oak Valley on a Tuesday morning in late July of 1884. And Clara Whitfield stepped off it the way a person steps off a plank, over dark water, carefully, deliberately, with the full knowledge that there was no going back. She was 29 years old. She carried one bag. Inside that bag was a change of clothes, a small Bible with her mother's handwriting. Inside the front cover, a folded letter offering her employment and $7.43, the total sum of everything she had left in the world after the funeral. After the debts. After the neighbors stopped bringing food, and the landlord started leaving notes under her door. Her husband, Daniel Whitfield, had been dead for 4 months. He had been a good man, a quiet man, a man who fixed things around their small house in Missouri and never raised his voice and brought her wildflowers in spring because he knew she loved them. He had also been a man with a bad cough that turned into something worse over one hard winter, and by February he was gone, and by March, Clara had sold everything that wasn't nailed down, and by June, she had read every posting for domestic work between St. Louis and the Montana Territory. The posting from Broken Oak Ranch had been simple. It read, "Need a woman capable of cooking and managing a household for 6 children. Room and board provided. Inquire to Thomas Callahan. Broken Oak Ranch, Harlan County, Montana Territory. 6 children." Clara had read that number 3 times. 6. She had no children of her own. She and Daniel had hoped, and then they had tried, and then Daniel had gotten sick, and hoping became something she couldn't afford anymore. So when she read that number 6, she felt something strange move through her. Not sadness. Not exactly. Something closer to recognition. The way you recognize a face you've never met, but feel you already know. She wrote back within the hour. Thomas Callahan's reply arrived 2 weeks later. It was short. 4 sentences. He confirmed the position was still available, stated that her duties would include cooking 3 meals daily, basic housekeeping, and assisting with the children's daily routine. He said room and board were provided and that the work was steady. He said he expected someone who could handle difficulty without complaint. He did not say please. He did not say thank you. He did not ask a single thing about her. Clara took the job anyway. The valley itself was beautiful, in the way that wild places are beautiful. Indifferent to you, stunning in spite of it. Mountains rose on 3 sides. The grass ran long and pale gold in the summer heat. The sky above Montana Territory stretched so wide and so blue that the first time Clara looked up at it from the stagecoach window, something inside her chest cracked open, just a little. The way a door cracks open when you're not sure yet whether you want to walk through it. The ranch was another mile beyond the valley's main road. The driver, a weathered man named Cletus, who had not said more than 6 words. The entire journey pointed at a dirt path cutting through a stand of cottonwood trees. "Broken Oak," he said. "Thank you," Clara said. Cletus looked at her bag, then at her, then at the path. "You sure about this, ma'am?" Clara picked up her bag. "No," she said honestly. "But I'm going anyway." Then she smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke and cattle and something else underneath, not unpleasant, but heavy. The smell of a place that had been carrying too much for too long. The house came into view as she cleared the cottonwoods. It was large enough, 2 stories a wide porch, a barn standing off to the left. But the porch railing had a section missing. 2 of the front windows had cloth pulled across them instead of glass. The kitchen garden was overgrown with weeds. A fence post near the gate leaned at an angle that suggested nobody had straightened it in a very long time. Clara stood at the gate for a moment. Then she walked through it. She was halfway to the front door when she heard the voice. "Who are you?" The voice came from the porch. She looked up and saw a girl standing there with her arms crossed over her chest and her chin tilted at an angle that announced she was the authority here, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. The girl was maybe 13. Reddish-brown hair pulled back in a braid that was coming loose. A dress that had been washed so many times the color had faded to something between blue and gray. Eyes that were older than her face. "My name is Clara Whitfield," Clara said. "I've been hired to cook and help with the household." The girl looked her over the way you'd inspect a horse you hadn't asked for. "Papa hired you." "He did." "Did he tell you there are 6 of us?" "He did." "Did he tell you what happened to the last one?" Clara paused. "He did not." The girl nodded slowly. Something shifted in her expression, not quite satisfaction, but close to it. The satisfaction of someone who already knows how a story ends. "She lasted 11 days, the girl said. "Left in the middle of the night. Didn't even say goodbye to the little ones." Clara looked at her steadily. "I'm not her," Clara said. The girl said nothing. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "A beat." "Emma," the girl said. "Emma Callahan." "Nice to meet you, Emma." Clara shifted her bag to her other hand. "Is your father home?" Thomas Callahan was in the barn. Emma led Clara there without another word, walking 3 paces ahead, with the posture of a girl who had learned not to follow anyone. He was working on a saddle when they came in. A big man, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and hands that looked like they had been built specifically for hard work, and then used for exactly that purpose every single day. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the stitch he was making, set the tool down, then turned. His eyes were gray. Not a warm gray. A flat working gray like the sky before a storm decides what it's going to do. He looked at Clara the way he'd looked at the fence post, like something that needed to be assessed for usefulness. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Callahan," Clara said. "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 29. The work is hard." "I assumed it would be." He studied her for another moment. "Emma," he said without looking at his daughter. "Take Mrs. Whitfield inside and show her the kitchen." "Yes, sir," Emma said, already turning. Clara looked at Thomas Callahan for one more second. "Thank you for the position," she said. He nodded once and turned back to the saddle. Clara followed Emma out of the barn and thought, "This is going to be one of the harder things I've ever done." She had been through harder. So, she kept walking. The kitchen was the first thing Clara tried to understand, because the kitchen was where she would spend most of her time and where she could do the most good quickly. It was a large room. It had potential. But it was also in a state that told a story about the last year and a half without a single word being spoken. The shelves were disorganized. Half the dry goods were nearly empty. 2 of the burners on the iron stove were unreliable, and there was a crack in the wall near the window that let in a thin draft even in July. Emma stood in the doorway watching. "I do the cooking now," Emma said. "Most of it." Clara turned from the shelves. "How long have you been doing it?" "Since Mama died." Clara looked at her. Emma said it the way you say things you have said so many times they've stopped having edges flatly factually without ceremony. "That's a lot to carry," Clara said. "Somebody had to." "Yes," Clara said. "I know." Something moved across Emma's face. Quick, almost invisible. She looked down. "The twins eat anything," Emma said back to business. "Samuel won't touch carrots or anything orange. Henry eats slow, don't rush him or he gets upset. And Ben—" She stopped. "Ben," Clara prompted gently. "Ben doesn't talk much anymore." Emma's voice stayed even. He used to. He talked all the time before, but after Mama died, he kind of... She pressed her lips together. He just got quiet. How old is Ben? 4. Clara turned back to the shelves. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. What does Ben like? She asked. Emma was quiet for a moment. He carries a wooden horse around everywhere. Mama fixed it for him once one of the legs was broken and she re-glued it. After she died, he wouldn't put it down. Clara didn't say anything. She began organizing the shelves. She met the others before supper. The twins Lily and Rose came bursting into the kitchen at 4:30, identical in every visible way, except that Rose had a small scar above her left eyebrow, and Lily talked slightly faster. They were 9 years old, and they hit the kitchen like a small weather event, both talking at once, both stopping abruptly when they saw Clara standing at the stove. "You're the new cook," Lily said. "I am," Clara said. "Are you going to leave?" Rose said. "I'm not planning to," Clara said. The twins exchanged one of those twin looks that communicated an entire conversation without sound. "Emma said the last one left in the middle of the night," Lily said. "I heard," Clara said. "She didn't even say goodbye," Rose said. Ben cried. "I won't leave without saying goodbye," Clara said. "That's a promise." Another twin look. "Okay," Lily said finally, apparently deciding this was good enough. "What are you making?" "Beef stew," Clara said. "If there are enough vegetables." "There's onions," Rose said, "and some potatoes. Henry dug some up last week." "Then we have enough." The twins settled at the kitchen table like they had always been there, and Clara moved around them without fuss, and somewhere in the first 20 minutes of that, something began quietly, unremarkably, like all the important things begin. Samuel came in at 5 o'clock. He was 11 with his father's coloring and the careful, watchful quality of a boy who had learned that showing too much of what he felt caused problems. He said hello to Clara with his eyes on the floor and sat at the far end of the table. Henry came in 5 minutes later. He was 8 with a round face and a slightly dreamy quality, like he was always half listening to something no one else could hear. He sat next to Samuel and immediately picked up a stick he'd been carving and went back to work on it. Ben came last. Clara heard him before she saw him, small feet on the wood floor, slow and deliberate. She turned from the stove. He was the smallest child she had ever seen who looked that old in the eyes. 4 years old with dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and a wooden horse held against his chest with both arms, the way you'd hold something irreplaceable. He stood in the doorway and looked at Clara with an expression that wasn't afraid exactly, but was careful, measuring. Clara crouched down so she was at his level. "Hello," she said. "My name is Clara. What's yours?" Ben looked at her. He didn't answer. She didn't push. "I'm making beef stew," she said conversationally, as if his silence were perfectly normal. "It's going to be ready in about an hour. Do you like stew?" Ben looked at her for another long moment. Then he gave one small, definitive nod. "Good," Clara said. "I'm glad." She stood back up and went back to the stove. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't express surprise at his silence, or attempt to coax more from him. She just accepted what he offered, one nod, and treated it like it was enough. Because it was. Across the table, Emma was watching. Clara could feel it. Thomas Callahan came in for supper at exactly 6:30. He washed his hands at the pump outside, dried them on a rough cloth hung by the door, and sat at the head of the table without ceremony. He looked at the pot Clara had placed in the center at the bread she'd found enough flour to make at the 6 faces around the table. He didn't say anything. Clara set a bowl in front of him. He picked up his spoon. The twins started talking about something they'd seen near the creek. Henry was still half in his own world. Samuel watched his father. Ben sat next to the empty chair at Thomas's left. Clara noticed that no one sat there, noticed that no one even put their things near it, and held his wooden horse on his lap under the table. Thomas ate. He ate the way a man eats when he's stopped tasting his food efficiently quietly, like it's maintenance rather than pleasure. Clara watched him for exactly as long as it took her to understand that, and then she looked away. "The stew is very good," Emma said suddenly quietly. It was directed at no one in particular, but it landed in the room like something dropped from a height. The twins looked up. Henry looked up. Samuel looked at Emma. Thomas Callahan set his spoon down for a moment. He looked across the table at Clara. "It is," he said. His voice was low, flat, but it was there. "Thank you," Clara said, simply, without making anything of it. Thomas Callahan picked his spoon back up. But something had shifted in the room. Something small. Something that could be missed entirely if you weren't paying attention. Clara paid attention. The first week was the hardest. Not because the work was beyond her, it wasn't. She had worked hard her whole life, and hard work was something she trusted. What was hard was the geography of grief she was navigating without a map. Every family carries its sadness in a specific shape, and the Callahan family's shape was this, the silence that lived in the middle of everything. They talked around it. They built their days around its edges. But it was always there, that specific, permanent, empty chair silence of a family that had lost its center and didn't know how to find a new one. The children had developed their own ways of managing it. Emma managed it by being indispensable. If she was needed, she didn't have time to grieve. If she was busy, the silence couldn't find her. The twins managed it by filling the air with enough noise to crowd it out. But at night, if you listened, you could sometimes hear them talking to each other in the low voices they saved for real things, and those conversations sounded different from their daytime chatter. Smaller, more careful. Samuel managed it by making himself invisible. He had learned somehow that strong feelings made adults uncomfortable, so he kept his locked away behind those careful eyes and that careful posture. Henry managed it by leaving his mind somewhere nobody else had access to. He was gentle and sweet, and he'd go whole meals barely present, floating in some inner space where the loss couldn't quite reach him. And Ben carried a broken wooden horse. That was how Ben managed it. Clara understood all of this the way she understood it, because she had spent 4 months of her own life doing the same mathematics, working out the specific shape of her own grief, navigating her own version of that empty chair silence, every single morning, when she woke up and reached across a cold bed. She did not make the children talk about it. She did not organize discussions or push feelings to the surface before they were ready. What she did was simple, and it was deliberate. She made the house feel like a place where good things happened. She woke before sunrise and had the kitchen warm by the time the first child came down. She cooked real food, not perfect food, not elaborate food, but food with care in it, which is a different thing entirely, and children always know the difference even when they can't name it. She fixed the draft in the kitchen wall with some cloth and pine pitch she found in the barn. She repaired a split in Samuel's boot with a leather strip and a needle, leaving it on the table for him to find without making a ceremony of it. She taught the twins how to make biscuits one afternoon when the rain kept everyone inside, and the 3 of them made such a disaster of the kitchen doing it that all 5 children ended up in there watching, and Henry actually laughed out loud, and the sound of it, real, uncomplicated child laughter, stopped Clara cold for just a second. It had been a long time since she'd heard that in this house. She could tell by the way the children themselves looked slightly startled, like they'd forgotten that sound was available to them. She didn't make it a moment. She just kept going. That was the most important thing. She just kept going. Thomas Callahan watched all of this. He didn't say much. He was not a man who said much under ordinary circumstances, and this was not an ordinary circumstance, so he said even less than usual. But he watched. Clara could feel his attention even when he was across the yard, even when his back was to the house. He was a man accustomed to assessment, to reading situations, reading terrain, reading weather. He turned that same careful attention on Clara, and she let him, because she had nothing to hide, and she wasn't trying to be anything other than what she was. What she was this, a woman who needed work, who had found it, and who intended to do it properly. She had not come to Broken Oak Ranch to find a family. She had not come here to replace anyone. She had come because she had $7.43 and a letter offering steady employment, and she was practical enough to understand that survival sometimes looks like taking the next available step and trusting that the ground will hold. But she had not accounted for Ben. Feuds. It was the end of her second week. Clara was on the porch in the early morning before the children were up with a cup of coffee when she heard small feet behind her. She turned. Ben stood in the doorway in his nightshirt hair, wild from sleep, wooden horse in both arms. "Good morning," Clara said. Ben looked at her. He walked to the edge of the porch railing, not toward her, but near her, and stood looking out at the yard. Clara looked out too. For a while, neither of them said anything. Then Ben held out the wooden horse, not to give it to her, just to show her, like he was making an introduction. Clara leaned over and looked at the horse carefully. She could see the repair on the front left leg, the line where the glue had been applied, where small hands had pressed the pieces back together. "He's beautiful," Clara said. Ben pulled the horse back against his chest. Then he said very quietly, in a voice that was rusty from disuse, "His name is Buck." Clara looked at him. She said, "That's a good name for a horse?" Ben nodded. He went back inside. Clara sat with her coffee. She did not cry. She was very careful not to cry because she was on a ranch with 6 children and a watchful employer, and crying was a luxury she could not afford in this light, in this moment. But inside in the place, she kept carefully locked during working hours, something cracked open the rest of the way. Thomas found her in the barn that evening fixing a harness that had needed attention for weeks. He stopped in the doorway. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I know," Clara said. She kept working. "But it needed doing." He was quiet. "Where did you learn harness work?" he asked. "My father," Clara said. "He ran a small farm in Ohio. I was his only child. He taught me what he knew." "When did you lose him?" 12 years ago. "Your mother." "The year before that." Thomas was quiet again. "Your husband," he said. "The letter mentioned you were widowed." 4 months ago," Clara said. She said it without flinching. She had learned that flinching invited pity, and pity was something she didn't know what to do with. Thomas leaned against the barn wall. "What was he like?" he asked. It was unexpected. It was, Clara realized, the first personal question he had asked her in 2 weeks. She looked up from the harness. "Quiet," she said. "Kind. He fixed things." She paused. "He never once raised his voice to me. Not once in 6 years." Thomas looked at the ground. "My wife," he said. "Margaret." He stopped, started again. "She was the one who made this place feel like something. I knew how to work the land. She knew how to make the land worth working." Clara looked at him. He was still looking at the floor. A man saying out loud something he hadn't said in a very long time, not because he wanted to, but because something in the evening air had made the words possible. "I hired 3 women before you," he said. "None of them stayed past 2 weeks." "Emma told me," Clara said. "I'm not an easy man," Thomas said. "I've noticed," Clara said. His eyes moved to her face, quick, checking whether that was an insult. She met his gaze evenly. Something moved across his expression. Not quite a smile. Something that had forgotten how to be a smile, but remembered the direction. "No," he said. "I reckon you have." He pushed off the wall. "Supper was good tonight," he said. "The bread especially." "Thank you," Clara said. "The children are—" He stopped, pressed his jaw. "They seem better, this past week." Clara didn't say anything. She went back to the harness. "Whatever you're doing," Thomas Callahan said gruffly, "keep doing it." He walked out of the barn. Clara sat in the quiet with the harness in her hands for a long moment. Then she went back to work. Huang. The valley itself was beginning to feel different to Clara by her 3rd week, not because anything grand had changed, but because she was learning its rhythms. The way the light hit the mountain in the morning sharp and golden. The way the wind came off the north ridge at mid-afternoon with a smell of pine in it. The particular sound the house made at night when the temperature dropped. She was learning the children the same way. Their rhythms, their tells. She knew that Emma moved slower on the days she was struggling, not slower in her work, but slower in herself, like she was pulling herself through something thick. On those days, Clara would find small reasons to work near Emma, without making her talk, just sharing the same air. And Emma never acknowledged this directly. But Clara noticed that she always seemed slightly lighter by the end of those afternoons. She knew that Samuel sometimes came and stood near the kitchen when he was troubled, not asking for anything, just standing there until whatever was pressing on him eased. She started keeping something simple on the table during those times, an apple, a piece of bread. Nothing that required acknowledgement, and Samuel would take it quietly and go, and the next time she saw him, he'd be easier in himself. She knew that the twins needed noise the way some people needed silence, and that underneath their noise, they were paying close attention to everything, and that they were the barometers of this family. When they were genuinely joyful, the whole house breathed differently, and when they went quiet, there was something wrong. She knew that Henry was more present than he appeared, and that he sometimes slipped her drawings without explanation. Small pencil sketches left on the kitchen table of horses or birds, or abstract shapes she couldn't always identify, and that these were his version of conversation. She kept every one, and she knew Ben. She was still learning Ben carefully, the way you learn something precious and fragile, not by handling it directly, but by moving around it gently until it becomes comfortable with your presence. He had said Buck's name. He had shown her the horse. Those were the two real communications he had offered in 2 weeks, and Clara treated them like the significant events they were. She began leaving small things on the windowsill of the back porch, where Ben liked to sit. Not for him, never directed at him, never labeled or intended. Just there. A river stone with an interesting color. A feather she'd found in the yard. A piece of wood worn smooth by water. By the end of the 3rd week, Ben had moved all of them to a small wooden box he kept under his bed. Thomas Callahan noticed things. He was not a man who talked about what he noticed, but he noticed. He noticed that his kitchen smelled like food again, not just sustenance, but actual food, the kind with effort in it. He noticed that Emma had been to the creek twice last week just because she wanted to, not because she had to, not because she was managing something. Just because she was 9, no 13, he kept forgetting she'd had a birthday, just because she was 13, and she felt apparently that she could afford to go to the creek. He noticed that Samuel had started talking at supper again. Not much, but some. He noticed that the twins had taught Clara some game they played, and that he'd heard laughter from the kitchen 2 evenings in a row, and that the laughter had stopped him in the yard both times, and held him there, standing in the dark outside his own house, listening to his children laugh. He noticed that Ben had said good morning to Clara at breakfast last Tuesday. Unprompted. The whole table had gone slightly still, because they all knew, they all carried the knowledge of Ben's silence like a collective held breath. And then Clara had just said good morning back, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and moved on, and the table had quietly exhaled. He noticed all of this, and he noticed Clara herself when he allowed himself to, which was not often, and which he shut down firmly whenever it started. He noticed the way she worked, not frantically, not performing effort, but steadily, with a kind of inner economy that spoke of someone who understood that the work never actually ended, so you had to move through it sustainably, or you'd burn yourself out before winter. He noticed that she never complained. He noticed that she asked questions only when she needed information, not to fill silence. He noticed that she had repaired 4 things around the house without being asked and without mentioning them. He noticed that she had stood between the twins and his temper one afternoon when he'd come in, frustrated from a bad day on the range, and spoken sharply. And she hadn't done it dramatically, hadn't made a scene of it. But she had stepped to where she was between him and them, and her presence there had stopped him cold, and he had looked at her, and then at his daughters, and he had walked back outside, and stood in the yard, breathing until the anger passed, which was not something he had done before in his life, because before, He had not had anyone capable of standing between him and his own worst impulses. He noticed all of it, and he did not know what to do with any of it. What he did was work. He worked from before sunrise until after dark. He handled the cattle, the fences, the hay, the accounts, the 1,000 mechanical demands of keeping a ranch alive. And he did not think about Clara Whitfield more than was strictly necessary. And when he found himself thinking about her anyway, he told himself it was simply because she was unusual, and unusual things were worth noticing, and that was all it was. He was lying to himself. He was doing it very well.
John Sung.
The trouble with Victor Hayes began in the 4th week. Clara heard his name first from the store owner in town, a stocky man named Harlow, who ran the general store, and who had known Thomas Callahan for 15 years, and who watched Clara fill a supply list with the expression of someone deciding whether a person deserves to be warned about something. He apparently decided she did. "You work for Callahan," he said as she was gathering flour. "I do," Clara said. Harlow leaned on the counter. "Victor Hayes been sniffing around the valley again," he said. "Man's been buying up land from ranchers who get into difficulty. 2 families sold out last spring. Didn't have much choice the way Hayes arranged things." Clara looked at him. "What do you mean arranged things?" Harlow made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Cattle going missing, equipment breaking. Nothing you can prove was deliberate. But it keeps happening to ranchers who won't sell to Hayes, and it doesn't happen to the ones who do." He straightened. "Callahan's been on Hayes's list a long time. Man's wanted that valley land since before Margaret Callahan died. Only thing that's kept him back is that Callahan won't bend, and he ain't been alone in this." "He's not alone now either," Clara said. Harlow looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I reckon he ain't." She carried the supplies back to the ranch, and she thought about what Harlow had said, and she thought about the lean lines of the ranch, the empty shelves, the broken fence post at the gate, and she thought about how those things looked from the outside vulnerable. The way a person looks when they've been carrying too much for too long and the carrying is starting to show. She thought about Thomas Callahan at the head of his table, eating without tasting, working without stopping, holding everything together through sheer stubbornness, while grief and isolation did their slow, quiet work of wearing a man down. She thought about Victor Hayes and what kind of man waited for another man's grief to create an opportunity. She thought, "Not if I can help it." She told Thomas that evening. He was at the table going over accounts when she came in, and she didn't soften it or circle around it. She sat down across from him and told him what Harlow had said. Thomas listened. When she finished, he set down his pen. "I know about Hayes," he said. "I figured," Clara said. "What are you going to do about it? Handle it. Alone. That's how I handle things." Clara folded her hands on the table. "That's also exactly what Hayes is counting on," she said. Thomas looked at her. "Excuse me," he said. "You handle things alone," Clara said. "Every man on this range handles things alone. That's your way. It's a fine way for a lot of things." She met his eyes. "But it's a terrible way to fight a man who's been systematically isolating people precisely because he knows they'll each try to fight alone. That's his strategy, Mr. Callahan. It's a good one, and you're all playing right into it." Thomas stared at her. "You've been here a month," he said. "I have," Clara said. "And I've talked to Harlow, and I've listened to what people say when they come through, and I've read the accounts on this table." She gestured at the ledger he was working on. "And I can see that this ranch is being squeezed. Not fast. Slowly. The way you squeeze something when you don't want anyone to notice until it's too late." Thomas was silent. "I'm not trying to tell you your business," Clara said. "I know this valley and these people, and I know the people you know, and I don't. But I know this: a single tree falls in the wind. A grove stands." Thomas Callahan looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of a man being shown something he had already half known, but had been too proud or too tired to fully look at. "You're saying talk to the other ranchers," he said. "I'm saying stop fighting in separate rooms of the same burning house," Clara said. Something moved through his expression. You don't pull your punches, he said.
I didn't come here to be agreeable, Clara said. I came here to be useful.
A silence. Thomas Callahan picked up his pen, then set it back down, then looked at the window. I'll think on it, he said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. And for Thomas Callahan, Clara was beginning to understand that was closer to a yes than most people ever got. She found Ben on the back porch that night before bed. He was sitting with his wooden horse in the dark, looking at the stars, and he didn't startle when she came out, which was itself a small thing she kept. She sat beside him at a respectful distance. The stars above Montana Territory were extraordinary, thick as sugar spilled across a black cloth close enough to feel like something you could reach up and stir with a hand. They sat for a while. "Buck likes stars," Ben said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her. Clara looked at the horse in his hands. "Is that right?" she said. "Mama used to say stars are just holes in the dark," Ben said, "where the light gets through." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I like that," she said. Ben considered this. He looked at the sky. "Do you miss your mama?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. "Every day." Ben nodded like that was the right answer, like he'd been waiting to know if she understood. "I miss mine too," he said. "I know you do," Clara said. "And it's okay to miss her. You can miss her your whole life, and that's okay." Ben held the horse a little tighter. "Emma says she's in the stars," he said. "What do you think?" Clara asked. Ben looked up for a long time. "I think she's in Buck," he said finally, with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old who has worked something out. Clara looked at the small wooden horse in his hands. "I think you might be right," she said. They sat together until the chill drove them inside, and when Ben went to bed, he turned at the doorway and looked at Clara, and what he did, then she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said, "Good night, Clara." Not ma'am. Not Mrs. Whitfield. Clara. She said good night back. She sat on the back porch by herself for a little while after in the dark, under those extraordinary stars, and this time she let herself cry. Just a little. Just enough. Then she went inside. She had work in the morning. She always had work in the morning. And she had stopped being afraid that the ground wouldn't hold. The morning after Ben said her name, Clara woke up different. Not different in any way she could explain to another person. Not lighter, not heavier, just shifted. Like something inside her had moved an inch to the left and found it fit better there. She was at the stove before sunrise the way she always was, and when the children came down one by one, she watched their faces the way she'd been watching them for a month now, reading them the way her father had taught her to read weather. Not by looking at the sky directly, but by feeling the air, by noticing the small signs that came before the visible ones. Emma came down first, the way Emma always did, already dressed and already arranging her face into its working expression. But this morning she stopped in the doorway and looked at Clara and said without preamble, "Ben talked to you last night." "He did," Clara said. Emma was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't said that many words in a row since before Mama died," she said. Clara turned from the stove. Emma was holding herself very carefully, the way she always did when something mattered too much for her to risk letting it show. Her arms crossed over her chest. Chin slightly lifted, eyes giving nothing away. "Emma," Clara said, "when's the last time someone took care of you?" Emma blinked. The question landed somewhere it hadn't been expected. "I don't need," she started. "That wasn't what I asked," Clara said. Emma looked at the floor. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you are," Clara said. "You are one of the finest 13-year-old human beings I have ever encountered in my life. You have been holding this family together through something that would have broken most grown adults." She paused. "And I am not asking you to stop being fine. I am just asking when somebody last looked after you." Emma's jaw worked.
Mama did,
she said, very quietly.
before.
All right, Clara said. She turned back to the stove. Sit down.
I can help. Emma Callahan, sit down.
Emma sat. Clara cooked her breakfast and set it in front of her before the other children came down and stood at the stove with her back to the table, while Emma ate, because she knew that a girl like Emma couldn't accept care if someone was watching her do it. She needed to receive it privately, invisibly, so she could pretend afterward that it hadn't meant quite so much. By the time the twins came thundering down the stairs, Emma's plate was empty, and her face was easier, and she was back to herself. Or rather, she was still herself, but the version of herself that had eaten breakfast before anyone else arrived, and had been for exactly 12 unwitnessed minutes. Just a girl eating a warm meal while somebody took care of the kitchen around her. Clara counted that as a victory. Thomas Callahan rode out before breakfast that morning, the way he sometimes did when the ranch needed him before the sun was fully up. But he came back at noon unusual, and instead of going straight to the barn or the fields, he came to the back of the house and knocked on the kitchen door frame. Clara was elbow-deep in bread dough. "Ride out with me," he said. She looked at him. "Now, after you finish that," he said, nodding at the dough, "I need to show you something." She finished the dough, covered it to rise, told Emma to watch the twins, and went out to where Thomas had 2 horses ready at the fence. He helped her mount without comment, which was not nothing. Thomas Callahan was a man who did not waste gesture, and an unnecessary hand offered meant something even if neither of them acknowledged it. They rode north along the fence line in silence for a while. Clara let him lead. She was learning that Thomas communicated in the spaces between words as much as in the words themselves, and that the worst thing you could do was rush those spaces. After about 10 minutes, he pulled up and dismounted and walked to the fence. 3 posts were down, not fallen down. Pulled down, deliberately efficiently by someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it to look like rot or weather if you didn't look closely. But if you looked closely, and Clara did, you could see the marks. "Second time this month," Thomas said. Clara looked at the posts, then at the land beyond the broken line. "Hayes's land borders here," she said, directly. "You have no way to prove it was him." "No." Clara straightened. "Did you talk to any of the other ranchers?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He picked up one of the broken posts and turned it in his hands. "Talked to Garrett Howe yesterday," he said. "North Ridge. He's had cattle go missing. 3 in the last month." "Howe's land is between yours and the Patterson claim," Clara said, running through what she'd learned from Harlow and from listening to conversations in town. Thomas looked at her. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I pay attention to everything," Clara said. "What did Howe say?" "He said he'd handled worse." "And," Thomas set the post down, "and his wife said the same thing you said." "He said that he was being a fool fighting alone." Clara looked at him. "Smart woman," she said. Thomas almost smiled. "She has her opinions," he said. "I'd like to meet her," Clara said. Thomas looked at her sidelong. "Might be arranged," he said. They rode back in the long afternoon light, and it was the longest stretch of time they had spent in each other's presence outside the house, and it was different out here. Inside, Thomas was the employer moving through his own home. Out here, he was something else, a man on land. He knew the way. You know something you have worked with your hands, something you have staked your life on, something you love the way quiet men love things without ceremony or announcement. Clara saw it in the way he moved through the grass. Easy, certain. She thought, no wonder Hayes wants this land. She thought, no wonder Thomas would rather die than give it up. She understood both of those things completely. So, the dinner that evening had an undercurrent. Thomas had said something at the table, casual, offhanded, the way he said most things about riding to Garrett Howe's place the following week. Emma looked up, Samuel looked up. The twins kept eating, but their noise level dropped just slightly, which meant they were listening. "How's bringing Patterson and Sutter, too?" Thomas said, addressing his plate. "Thought we'd talk over some fence business." Clara said nothing. Emma said nothing. But across the table, their eyes met for just a second, and in that second, an entire conversation happened. Two women of very different ages who had both figured out exactly what fence business meant, and what it meant that Thomas Callahan was doing it. Ben looked up from his stew. "Buck wants to go to the Howe Ranch," he announced. The whole table paused. Then Henry, without looking up from his stew, said seriously, "Buck has never been to the Howe Ranch." "He hasn't," Ben agreed. "That's why he wants to go." The twins lost it completely. Clara did not look at Thomas, but she heard it, the quiet exhale beside her, the smallest possible shift in his breathing. The thing that wanted to be laughter and got out as breath instead. She focused very hard on her stew. It was Lily who found the warning. 3 days later, early on a Thursday morning, Lily came into the kitchen holding a piece of paper with both hands, like it was something that had bitten her. "This was tied to the fence post," she said. "The front gate." Clara took it. She read it once, then she set it on the table face down and looked at Lily. "Where's your father?" "Barn." "Go back outside and play with Rose," Clara said. "Don't mention this to your brothers or Ben yet, all right?" Lily's eyes were wide. "What does it say?" she whispered. "Nothing you need to worry about," Clara said. "Calm, even." "Go find Rose." Lily went. Clara picked up the paper and walked to the barn. Thomas was working on the same saddle she'd seen him working on the first day she arrived. She had a brief, strange thought, how long does it take to fix one saddle? And then she handed him the paper without preamble. He read it. His face changed, not dramatically. A tightening, a stillness, the kind that came before something either broke or held. The note was not signed. It didn't need to be. It said in a plain hand that the Broken Oak Ranch was sitting on land that would be better used by people with the resources to properly manage it, and that the current owner would find his situation considerably more difficult in the coming months, if he didn't see sense, and that it would be a shame if the difficulties a man had already suffered were to multiply. A shame if the difficulties a man had already suffered were to multiply. Thomas read that line twice. Then he set the paper down on the workbench and put both hands flat on the surface and stood there breathing for a moment. Clara waited. "He mentioned the children," Thomas said, very quietly. "Not directly," Clara said. "He didn't need to." He looked up. "A man who mentions the difficulties I've already suffered is talking about Margaret. He's talking about everything that happened after her. And he's saying he knows I'm alone, and he's saying he ain't afraid of me." His voice was low and dangerously controlled. "He is making a mistake. Thomas." She hadn't called him that before, by his first name. It came out before she'd made a decision about it. If you go after him angry, he wins. That's what he wants. A fight he can document. A cowboy who loses his temper and gives him the excuse he needs to involve the county. Thomas looked at her. "He tied that note to my gate," he said, "where my daughter found it." "I know. She's 9 years old." "I know that too," Clara said. "And that is exactly why you can't give him what he wants." She held his gaze. "Move the meeting with Howe up. This week. Bring the note. Bring everything you have documented about the fences and the missing cattle. Start building something he can't tear down with a fight." Thomas stared at her. "You're asking me to be patient," he said, like it was an accusation. "I'm asking you to be smart," Clara said. "There's a difference." A long silence. Thomas picked up the note, folded it, put it in his shirt pocket. "Get Howe here by Saturday," he said. Not to Clara, to himself already working. "I'll make sure there's food for everyone," Clara said. He looked at her. Something passed across his expression that she couldn't fully read. Gratitude, maybe? Or something older and more complicated than gratitude, The feeling of a man who has been fighting alone for so long that a hand offered beside him feels almost more frightening than the fight. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "Clara," she said. He stopped. "Clara," he said. And something about hearing him say it the way it sat in his voice, careful like something placed precisely, made her look somewhere else briefly. At the saddle, at the wall, at anything that wasn't his face. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. Doug. The meeting happened on Saturday morning, and it was nothing like what Clara expected, and exactly like what she expected, which was the way most real things worked. Garrett Howe was a bear of a man, white-bearded and red-faced, with the kind of laugh that made dogs bark and children run toward rather than away. His wife Nora was small and dark-eyed and sharp as a fence wire, and within 4 minutes of meeting Clara had assessed her completely, and apparently decided she approved because she squeezed Clara's arm and said, "Good," with enormous finality before going inside to help with coffee. Patterson was quieter, a lean man from Tennessee, with the deliberate speech of someone who chose every word before releasing it. Sutter came with his oldest son, a young man barely 20, who sat beside his father with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone attending a funeral who hoped it might turn into something else. They sat at Thomas's table. Clara kept coffee and food coming and did not attend the meeting. It wasn't her place, and she knew it, but the kitchen shared a wall with the dining room, and she could hear through it clearly enough. She heard Thomas lay out the fence damage, the missing cattle, the note. She heard Garrett Howe's voice drop into a lower register, the register of a man who is very, very angry and very, very calm about it. "He left a note at your gate," Howe said. "Found by my daughter," Thomas said. A pause. "I've been finding things too," Patterson said. "Notes, not at my gate, at my barn. I didn't mention it because—" A pause. "I didn't want to appear unable to handle my affairs." Sutter exhaled. "He left one of my workers," Sutter said. "A good man. 14 years. Hayes offered him double wages and the man took it. I can't blame him. But now I'm short a hand and Hayes knows every corner of my operation." Clara listened to the silence that followed that. Then she heard Thomas say, "He's been doing this one piece at a time, and we've each been picking up our piece alone." "Because that's what we do," Howe said. "It's what he counted on," Thomas said. Clara pointed out to me. A pause. A small one. "Someone pointed out to me that isolation is his strategy. Every time one of us refuses help and refuses to speak about what's happening, he gets stronger. Because he's the only one with a complete picture." Another silence. "So what do we do?" Sutter's son said. Young voice, a little rough. "We just talk to each other. We document everything," Thomas said. "Together, every damaged fence, every missing animal, every note, every word from anyone who works for any of us that might have been approached by Hayes or his people. We build a record that no single man could dismiss because it isn't coming from a single man." Clara heard Nora Howe say quietly, "That is the most sensible thing I have heard a man say in 5 years." Garrett Howe laughed his dog-alarming laugh. "My wife agrees with you," he said to Thomas. "God help you, Callahan, you've got 2 of them now." Clara heard a pause. She did not hear what Thomas said to that if he said anything. She was very carefully focused on the stove. The men rode out in the early afternoon, and the ranch settled back into its usual rhythms, but the rhythms were different, fuller somehow, like a room that has had a window opened in it. Nora Howe stayed. She and Clara ended up at the kitchen table with coffee, while the children were outside, and they talked in the direct, comfortable way 2 women talk when they've each decided quickly that the other one is worth their time. "How long?" Nora asked, meaning, "How long have you been here?" "Coming up on 6 weeks," Clara said. Nora looked at her over her coffee cup. Direct. "How bad was it when you arrived?" Clara thought about the lean shelves, the broken fence post, Ben's silence, Emma's aging eyes. "Bad enough," Clara said. "He's not an easy man," Nora said. "Not critically, just factually." "He's not?" Clara agreed. Margaret was the one who made him human, Nora said. I don't mean that unkindly. Thomas Callahan is a decent man, a good man. But he is the kind of good man who can go so far into himself that people stop being able to reach him. Margaret could always reach him. She looked at her cup. After she died, I worried about this place, about those children. They're strong, Clara said. They are, Nora said. But children shouldn't have to be that strong. Strong is something that happens to children when soft isn't available. Clara looked at her. You have children, Clara asked. Grown now, Nora said. But I remember. She paused. Emma especially. That girl. You know what I see when I look at Emma Callahan? I see a child who made herself a grown woman because someone had to. And what worries me is that she's very good at it. So good nobody remembers she doesn't have to be. I remember, Clara said quietly. Nora looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said. I can see that you do. They drank their coffee. He watches you, Nora said without preamble, just stating a fact. Clara set her cup down carefully. He watches everything on his property, Clara said. Nora smiled. It was a small, knowing, deeply unsentimental smile. The smile of a woman who had been married long enough to find men's self-deceptions fondly amusing. Yes, she said. I'm sure that's what it is. Clara looked out the window. I work for him, she said. Of course, Nora said pleasantly. Clara picked up her coffee. I am a widow of 4 months, Clara said, and I came here because I needed work. Of course, Nora said again in exactly the same tone. Clara looked at her. Nora looked back perfectly serene. Mrs. Howe, Clara said. Nora, she said. Nora, Clara said. I am not here to... I know what you're not here to do, Nora said. Nobody ever is. She patted Clara's hand once efficiently and stood up. More coffee. Clara sat for a moment. Yes, she said. Please. Chum. That night Thomas came in late. The children were long in bed. Clara had banked the stove and was sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and the mending basket, which was never actually empty. 6 children created a continuous stream of things requiring fixing, which Clara found she didn't mind, because mending was the kind of work you could do while thinking. She was thinking about Nora Howe's smile. She was thinking about Saturday morning at the table, when Thomas said Clara instead of Mrs. Whitfield, and the way that small syllable had moved through her chest. She was thinking that she was being extremely foolish, and that she knew better than this. Thomas came through the back door and stopped when he saw the light. You're up, he said. Mending, she said. He hung his hat, crossed to the stove, and touched the side of the coffee pot, found it still warm enough, and poured a cup. He stood at the counter with it and drank for a moment. Hal wants to move on this quickly, he said. Before autumn, before Hayes can make another move. Good, Clara said. Patterson's going to start keeping records this week. Every head of cattle, every piece of equipment, every hire and fire. So if Hayes moves on him again, there's a baseline to compare against. Smart, Clara said. Sutter's son. Thomas paused. He's young. He was listening, Clara said. The whole time. He wants to do right by his father. Thomas looked at her. You were in the kitchen, he said. The walls in this house are not as thick as you might want, Clara said. Something moved across his expression. Not annoyance. Something closer to amusement. I'll remember that, he said. He came and sat at the table. Across from her, one chair over. He turned the coffee cup in his hands the way he did when he was working something out. You said something a few weeks ago, he said, about a grove standing. I remember, Clara said. I've been thinking about it. He looked at the cup. My father always said a man's land was his business and nobody else's. You kept to yourself, you built what you could build, and you didn't ask for help because asking for help was the same as admitting you couldn't manage. A lot of men were raised that way, Clara said. He wasn't wrong necessarily. Thomas said slowly. That kind of thinking built something, built this. He gestured at the house around them. But, he stopped. But, Clara said carefully, but Margaret used to say that some things couldn't be built alone. He was quiet for a moment. She never said it like an argument, just stated it, like it was as obvious as weather. Some things can't be built alone, Thomas. She'd say it and keep right on doing whatever she was doing. He set the cup down. I told her she was right once, and she just said I know. His mouth almost moved into a smile. She never asked me to say it twice. Clara kept her hands steady on the mending. She sounds like she was remarkable, Clara said. She was, Thomas said simply. She was the best person I ever knew. He looked at the table. And after she died, I told myself the best I could do was keep working, keep the ranch going, keep the children fed, because that was what I could do. The rest of it... He stopped. The rest of it, I didn't know how to do without her. Clara looked at him. He was not a man who said things like this. She could see the effort in every word, a man prying open something he had kept sealed for survival. The rest of it, she said quietly, is what the children needed most. I know, he said. I know that. He met her eyes. I could see it, and I couldn't reach it. Does that make sense to you? More than you know, Clara said. A silence. Thomas looked at her hands in the lamplight, moving through the mending with that steady economy she'd noticed from the first week. You do this every night, he said. After the children are down, she said. It's quiet work. I like quiet work after a full day. Daniel, he said. Your husband. What did he do in the evenings? Clara looked up. Read, she said. He was a reader. He'd sit by the lamp and read for an hour before bed, and sometimes read out loud if he found something good. She paused. I used to fall asleep listening to his voice. Thomas was quiet. I used to talk to Margaret, he said, after the children were in bed. About everything. The ranch, the neighbors, things that didn't matter, things that did. He looked at the window. The hardest part of being alone isn't the work. The work I can manage. The hardest part is having nobody to tell the day to at the end of it. Clara felt that like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. Yes, she said softly. That's it exactly. They sat with that for a moment. The lamp between them, the quiet house, the sound of the ranch settling around them. Clara, Thomas said. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for what you've done here, for the children, for... He stopped, pressed his jaw. For reminding me how to fight the right way. She looked at him steadily. You never forgot how to fight, she said. You were just fighting in the wrong direction, inward instead of outward. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved between them. Neither of them named it, neither of them reached for it, but it was there in the kitchen air, as real as the lamplight, as real as the coffee going cold on the table. Thomas stood. Get some sleep, he said, not unkindly, carefully. Good night, Clara said. He crossed to the stairs, stopped. Ben talked at dinner again today, he said without turning. 3 sentences. I counted. Clara looked down at the mending. I heard, she said. You did that, Thomas said. Ben did that, Clara said. I just sat next to him while he figured it out. A pause. Maybe, Thomas said. But you sat there first. He went upstairs. Clara sat in the lamplight for a while. Her hands on the mending had gone still. She made herself pick it up again. She made herself finish the seam she was on. She made herself think about practical things, the flour supply, the loose board on the porch step, the letter she needed to write to an old friend in Missouri. She made herself think about anything, except the way her name sounded, when Thomas Callahan said it in that careful, deliberate voice. She was not very successful, but she kept her hands moving, and she told herself, You are here to work. You are here because you needed work, and this family needed help, and that is the whole of it, and you will not complicate a situation that is working precisely because it is uncomplicated. She told herself that all the way up to bed. She almost believed it by the time she got there. 3 things happened in the following week that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Emma asked Clara to teach her to make the apple butter. It sounds small. It was not small. Emma Callahan had spent a year managing this kitchen out of necessity and pride, and asking someone to teach her something in her own kitchen was for Emma the equivalent of any other person going down on one knee. It was an act of trust so deliberate and so enormous for that girl that Clara received it with the seriousness it deserved. They made apple butter on a Tuesday afternoon side by side, and Emma asked questions and listened carefully, and at one point when Clara showed her the way to test the set, Emma leaned close and watched with the focused attention she brought to everything, and Clara thought, "This girl is going to be extraordinary. Whatever she decides to do with her life, she is going to be extraordinary at it." She said so. Emma looked up. "Don't do that," Emma said. "Do what?" "Say things like that, like you know." "I do know," Clara said. Emma looked back at the pot. "You don't know anything about my life," she said, but quietly, without the edge. "I know you've been running this household since you were 12, Clara said. "I know you took care of 5 children while also being a child yourself. I know you can do the work of 3 adults before breakfast and still manage to look after your brothers and sisters better than most grown women manage their own families." She paused. "I know when I look at you, I see someone who doesn't know yet how much she is capable of. That's the most important thing I know." Emma stirred the pot. Her jaw was working. "Mama used to say things like that," she said finally, very quiet. Clara didn't say anything. "I keep thinking," Emma said, "that one day I'll stop expecting to hear her voice. That one day I'll wake up and I just won't expect it anymore. And then it won't hurt so much when it isn't there." "Maybe," Clara said gently. "Or maybe you'll just get better at carrying it." Emma looked at her. "Does it get better?" "Actually," Clara looked at the pot. "It changes," she said honestly. "It doesn't disappear, but it changes. The sharpest edges wear down. And one morning, you wake up and you think of them, and it's different. Still there, but different." Emma looked back at the pot. "Okay," she said. The apple butter set beautifully. Emma stood over it with something in her expression that was quiet and complete, the look of a person who has made something real. "Can I give some to Mrs. Howe?" she asked. "It's yours," Clara said. "Do whatever you like with it." Emma almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a full smile Clara had seen on her. She counted it. The second thing that happened was Henry. Henry left a drawing on the table on Wednesday morning, as he did without announcement, without explanation. Clara picked it up and looked at it and stopped. It was a drawing of the kitchen, their kitchen, the table, the stove, the window. And around the table, small, careful figures, the twins Samuel Ben with his wooden horse Emma at the stove, Thomas at the head of the table, and at the other end of the table a figure with long hair and an apron. Clara stared at the drawing. Henry came and stood beside her. "That's you," he said, pointing at the aproned figure, as if she might not know. "I see that," Clara said. Henry studied the drawing along with her. "You fit," he said. Clara looked at him. Henry had already moved on, drifting toward the back porch, with his stick carving already half returned to wherever his mind usually lived. Clara set the drawing down on the table. She pressed her hand flat on it for just a second. "You fit." She was going to have to be much, much more careful about her own heart. The third thing that happened was Victor Hayes. He came to the ranch on Thursday afternoon uninvited, which was in itself a message. Men like Victor Hayes didn't make unannounced social calls. They made demonstrations. He was not what Clara expected. She had built him in her mind as the villain of a certain specific type, loud, crude, obvious. But Hayes was none of those things. He was perhaps 50 with a careful face and careful clothes, and the manner of a man who had spent decades being precisely as pleasant as the situation required. He rode up to the front of the house with 2 men behind him and asked for Thomas Callahan, with the easy confidence of someone who expected to be received. Thomas came out from the barn. Clara was at the window. She watched Thomas walk across the yard, and she saw the moment he recognized Hayes's horse, and the set of his shoulders changed. Not fear, not anger, something controlled and cold that was more dangerous than either. "Hayes," Thomas said. "Callahan." Hayes smiled. Easy. Open. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Thomas said. "But you knew that." Hayes's smile didn't waver. "I've been meaning to come out personally for some time," Hayes said. "I think there are some misunderstandings between us that a conversation might clear up." "I understand your position clearly," Thomas said. "My position," Hayes said, "is simply that I'd like to discuss possibilities. The valley's changing. Costs are going up. Some operations that made sense 10 years ago are becoming difficult to sustain." He looked at the house. His eyes moved over it the way a surveyor's eyes move over property. "I have no interest in causing difficulty for anyone, Callahan. I am a businessman. I prefer transactions to conflicts." "Then stop damaging my fences," Thomas said. Hayes looked mildly surprised. "Perform surprise the kind a man practices until it looks genuine." "I don't know anything about your fences," he said. "No," Thomas said. "I don't expect you'll know anything about the note on my gate either." Something moved through Hayes's expression. Quick. Gone. "I came to make an offer," Hayes said. "A fair one." "I'm not selling," Thomas said. "Callahan." "I am not selling," Thomas said. "This conversation is finished. Get off my land." A silence. Hayes looked at Thomas for a long moment. Then he looked at the house again. His eyes moved to the window where Clara was standing. She did not move. He looked at her for just a second, assessing the way he assessed everything. Then he looked back at Thomas. "I hope you're thinking about those children," Hayes said. The pleasant tone was unchanged. That was what made it threatening. A man in your situation has to think carefully about what kind of future he's able to offer. Things can become very difficult for a family without... "Get off my land," Thomas said again, very quietly. Hayes gathered his reins. "I'll be in touch," he said. He rode out. His 2 men followed. Thomas stood in the yard watching them go. Clara watched Thomas. She could see it from the window, the control it was costing him to stand there and do nothing. The way his hands were open and flat at his sides, like he was physically choosing not to form them into fists. When the riders were out of sight, he turned and looked at the house. He looked at the window. He met Clara's eyes through the glass. She shook her head. One small, deliberate movement. Not now. Not like this. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. He went back to the barn. Clara stepped back from the window and stood in the kitchen with her hands on the table and thought about Victor Hayes's eyes moving over this house the way a surveyor's eyes move. Calculating. Patient. She thought about the note, about the fences, about the careful, pleasant, cold confidence of a man who had done this before and who had never yet been stopped. She thought about Thomas standing in his yard, holding his hands flat and open at his sides. She thought about Emma making apple butter and Henry's drawing, and Ben's voice saying "Good night, Clara" in the dark. She thought, this man is not going to take this from them. And then she thought, what am I going to do about it? She didn't have the answer yet, but she felt it forming. The way weather forms, not yet visible but present in the air, inevitable building towards something that was going to arrive whether you were ready or not. She put water on to boil. She started supper. She did not tell the children what had happened, and she did not show the tightness in her chest, and when Thomas came in at dark, she looked at him across the kitchen, and he looked at her, and they had the conversation without words. I know not yet, but soon. And then they sat down to supper, with 6 children around them, and Clara made herself be present, completely. made herself laugh when the twins were funny, and respond when Samuel tried to start a conversation about the horses and accept the small river stone Ben pressed into her hand before bed. She did all of it. And underneath it, the thing she was building was building. She just needed a little more time. She just needed the pieces to come together. And she was beginning slowly with the careful certainty of a woman who had learned to trust the ground only after she'd tested each step. She was beginning to understand that the pieces were already there. She just needed to be the one to show Thomas Callahan how to use them. The document from Patterson arrived on a Monday. Clara was in the kitchen when Thomas brought it in. Not a warning this time, not a note tied to a fence post in the dark. An actual document. Printed on county letterhead, with a seal at the bottom, and a signature Clara recognized immediately, because Harlow at the general store had mentioned the name twice, with a particular kind of disgust reserved for things that smell wrong. County Assessor Raymond Briggs. She read it over Thomas's shoulder. She had to read it twice, because the language was careful and bureaucratic, and designed to obscure what it was actually saying, which was that Broken Oak Ranch had been flagged for a property assessment review based on reported concerns about operational capacity and land management standards, and that a county representative would be visiting within 30 days to evaluate the property's current condition and tax valuation. Thomas set it on the table. He went to the county. Thomas said. "He's been planning this longer than we thought," Clara said. "If Briggs comes out here and decides this ranch isn't being properly managed..." Thomas stopped. "He can recommend a forced sale. It's happened before. 2 years ago, the Larson family couldn't prove anything was wrong with their management, but Briggs said the land wasn't being developed to its potential, and the county agreed, and 6 months later Hayes owned it." Clara looked at the document again. "When did the Larsons fight back?" she asked. "They didn't," Thomas said. "They didn't know they could." "We know we can," Clara said. "How long do we have?" 30 days. "Then we have 30 days to make this ranch look like exactly what it is," Clara said. "A well-managed, thriving operation with community standing and documented history." She looked up. "Get Howe. Get Patterson. Get Sutter. Get everyone who came Saturday and everyone who didn't. We need witnesses, Thomas. People who can stand up in front of a county representative and say they know this land and this man, and there is nothing wrong with this operation." Thomas looked at her. "You said Thomas again," he said. She stopped. He wasn't making a point of it. He said it quietly, like he was noting something he wasn't sure how to feel about yet. "I did," Clara said. "A beat." "I don't mind it," he said. He picked up the document and went out to saddle his horse. Clara stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table for exactly 10 seconds. Then she started making a list of everything that needed to be done. The next 2 weeks moved differently from any of the weeks before. There was an urgency now that lived in the air of the ranch, the way a change in weather lives in air, not visible but entirely present, pressing against every ordinary moment. Thomas rode out to the neighboring ranches. He came back each day with news, with names, with information that built slowly into something resembling a strategy. Garrett Howe, it turned out, had been through a property review 7 years ago. He knew the process. He sat at Thomas's table on Wednesday evening and laid it out in plain terms what Briggs would look for, what he'd be directed to look for, how Hayes's influence at the county level worked, and more importantly, where it had limits. "Briggs is Hayes's man," Howe said. "But he's not stupid. He knows if he's too obvious he loses his position. He needs justification. Real justification, or something that looks real enough." He looked at Thomas. "What does this ranch look like right now, honestly?" Thomas was quiet. Clara spoke. "The house needs work," she said. "The north fencing is down in 2 sections. The records for the cattle haven't been properly kept since..." She stopped. Looked at Thomas. "Since before I arrived." Thomas's jaw tightened. Not at Clara, at the truth. "The books are in order," he said. "The books are in order," Clara agreed. "But a man visiting for 30 minutes doesn't look at books first. He looks at what he can see. And right now, what he can see needs attention. Then we fix what he can see, Howe said simply. In 30 days, Thomas said. We fix it in 2 weeks, Howe said. And we spend the other 2 weeks making sure every man in this valley knows who Raymond Briggs is and what he's being asked to do here. Nora Howe, who had come with her husband, and who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table with her coffee, said, "And the women." Every man at the table looked at her. "The women know things," Nora said pleasantly. "We talk to each other in places you don't go, and we know things about Raymond Briggs that you might find useful." She sipped her coffee. "For instance, Briggs has a brother-in-law who owes Patterson's bank a considerable sum of money, and that bank is the same bank that holds the note on Briggs's house." She set down the cup. "Just a thought." Patterson looked at his hands. "My wife told me that," he said slowly. "I didn't think it was relevant." "It's very relevant," Nora said. Clara caught the woman's eye across the table. Nora gave her the smallest nod. 2 women speaking without words. This is how it works. This is what they miss. This is exactly why we pay attention. The work started the next morning. Ranchers arrived before sunrise, not 2 or 3 but 8 with their hands and their sons, and in 2 cases their older daughters, who were as capable with fence posts as anyone. They spread across the Broken Oak Ranch like water, finding its level, filling every gap, addressing every visible weakness, with the practiced efficiency of people who knew what needed doing, because they dealt with the same things on their own land. Thomas worked beside them. Clara watched his face that first morning when he came out of the barn and saw 8 horses and a dozen people already moving across his property. She watched him stop. She watched something move through him that was too complicated to name: pride and humility and gratitude, all fighting each other at once, the particular discomfort of a man who has spent his whole life refusing help, suddenly receiving it in abundance. Howe clapped him on the shoulder as he passed. "Don't make it a thing," Howe said. "We'd expect the same." Thomas nodded, pressed his jaw, went to work. Clara fed everyone. That was her job in this, and she did it with everything she had. Breakfast at dawn, coffee and bread, mid-morning, a full dinner at noon, for however many mouths showed up, which varied between 12 and 20, depending on the day. She cooked quantities she'd never cooked before, and she recruited Emma and Nora Howe and 2 other women who came with their husbands, and the kitchen became a different kind of place, loud and warm and cooperative women, moving around each other with the ease of people doing necessary work together. Emma thrived. That was the word for it. The girl who had managed this kitchen alone for a year, who had carried the weight of it in isolation, suddenly had capable adults working beside her and treating her competence as the real thing. It was, rather than a touching compensation for tragedy, and the difference in her was visible. She stood straighter. She laughed more. She made decisions in the kitchen, and people followed them without question, because her decisions were right, and Clara watched her realize slowly across several days that her abilities were not just adequate, they were genuinely exceptional. On the 4th day of work, one of Sutter's hands, a capable woman named May, who had cooked for large crews before, stood back from the stove and told Emma her biscuit method was better than anything she'd learned in 15 years of range cooking. Emma said, "Thank you," in a voice that was almost steady. Clara turned away and found something to do at the other end of the kitchen. She was not going to cry in front of May. Ben had started talking in the mornings. Not constantly, not in the unstoppable stream of most 4-year-olds, but in the careful, considered way of a child who chooses his words because he has been without them long enough to understand they have value. He talked to Clara first always, as if she were the safe practice ground before the wider world. "Buck doesn't like the hammering," he told her one morning, clutching his horse at the table. "Loud, isn't it?" Clara agreed. "He says it hurts his ears." "Horses have sensitive ears," Clara said seriously. "You might tell him the hammering will stop in a few days. That usually helps." Ben considered this. "How does a horse know what days are?" he asked. Clara thought about it. "They feel it," she said. "In the air. Animals always know when something is almost finished. Ben looked at Buck. "I'll tell him," he decided. He relayed this information to the wooden horse in a low, serious murmur, and Clara poured his milk and told herself she was absolutely not going to make a production of any of this, and managed it successfully until Thomas came in for his morning coffee and saw Ben talking to his horse at the table, and looked at Clara with something in his eyes so unguarded and so real that she had to pour the coffee very carefully indeed. "He's explaining the construction timeline," she said. Thomas looked at his son. "Is Buck satisfied?" he asked. Completely seriously. Ben looked up. "He says 3 more days is acceptable," Ben reported. Thomas nodded. He looked at Ben for a moment, a father looking at his child, really looking present in the way he hadn't always been in those first weeks. "Tell him we appreciate his patience," Thomas said. Ben nodded and turned back to his horse. Thomas caught Clara's eye over his son's head. She looked at him steadily, and he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them moved, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it too large for the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning. He picked up his coffee and went out. Clara stared at the stove for a moment. Careful, she told herself. Be careful. The twist came from a direction nobody expected. It was Samuel who found it. He came home from school on a Thursday afternoon. School was 3 miles down the valley road, and the older children made the trip on horseback 3 days a week, and he came in with a different face than he'd left with. Not afraid, not angry. Something worse than both. Crushed. He sat at the kitchen table and didn't take off his coat and didn't reach for the food Clara had left out, which she had never seen him fail to do, and she looked at him and set down what she was holding. "Samuel," she said. He didn't answer. "Samuel, look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were dry but barely. "What happened?" she said. He pressed his mouth closed, opened it, pressed it again. "Briggs's son goes to school," Samuel said finally. "Will Briggs. He's 12. Clara sat down across from him. "What did Will Briggs say to you?" she said carefully. Samuel's jaw worked. "He said his father already made the decision," he said. "About our ranch. He said it didn't matter what we fixed or who came to help us. The decision was already made. That his father was going to recommend the forced sale, and Hayes was going to buy it." His voice was steady and terrible with the effort of keeping it that way. He said our mother being dead meant there was nobody to fight for us properly. That a house with no mother and a cook who wasn't family was... He stopped. "What did he say?" Clara said. "He said we were already a ranch nobody wanted to save," Samuel said. "That everybody coming to help us was just pity, not real support. Just people feeling sorry for us, and that when it came down to it nobody was going to stand against Hayes for us, because we weren't worth the trouble." Silence. Clara looked at this 11-year-old boy sitting in his coat at the kitchen table, with his hands flat on the wood, and his dry, terrible eyes, and his careful, aching voice, and she felt a fury so clean and so cold that it nearly took her breath. She did not show it. "Samuel," she said, "I need you to hear me." He looked at her. "Will Briggs is 12 years old," she said, "and he is repeating what he has heard his father say. And his father is a man who has already decided what to believe because he is being paid to believe it." She paused. "None of that is the truth. None of it. Do you understand the difference between what a man says and what is true?" Samuel was quiet. "The Howes are not here out of pity," Clara said. "Garrett Howe has been fighting his own battles for 30 years, and he does not do anything out of pity. He's here because your father is the kind of man who earns that. Patterson is here because when Hayes came for the Larsons 2 years ago, nobody stood with them, and Patterson has regretted it ever since." She leaned forward. "And as for nobody wanting to save a house without a mother..." She stopped. Samuel was looking at her. "You're here," he said, very quiet. Clara held his gaze. "I'm here," she said. He looked at the table. "Are you going to stay?" he asked, and it cost him to ask it. She could see the cost, see how much it mattered to him, see how carefully he'd been building walls against caring about the answer. "Samuel," she said carefully, "I don't know what the future holds. I don't make promises I can't keep. What I can tell you right now is that I am not going anywhere, and what I can tell you absolutely is that you and your sisters and your brothers and your father are not people nobody wants to save." She held his eyes. "I want to save it, and I am not a pity call." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he took off his coat. He reached for the food on the table. He ate. Clara went back to what she'd been doing and let him be, because what he needed was not more words. He'd had the words. What he needed was the ordinary quiet of someone present and calm beside him, going about their work, not making his fear the center of the room. When Thomas came in an hour later, she took him quietly to the back porch and told him what had happened. Thomas's face went very still. "The boy told you this," he said. "He came home carrying it," Clara said. "He needed someone to hear it. He should have come to me." "Maybe," Clara said, "but he came to me, and that's all right. That's what I'm here for." Thomas looked at the yard. "Hayes is using his son," he said. "Using a 12-year-old boy to get at my 11-year-old son." "He's using every available pressure point," Clara said. "That's who he is. The question isn't what he is. The question is what we're going to do before that assessment visit." Thomas turned to her. "Tell me," he said. And for the first time, he said it without hesitation, without the subtle resistance of a proud man accepting counsel. He just said it. "Tell me the way you say it to someone you have decided to trust." Clara told him. What? They went to Nora Howe the next morning. Nora listened to everything. She sat at her own kitchen table with her hands folded and her sharp eyes moving between Clara and Thomas, and she asked 3 precise questions, and then she sat quiet for a moment. "Raymond Briggs has been the county assessor for 9 years, she said. "He was appointed, which means he can be removed." "By who?" Thomas said. "By enough county residents making enough noise at the right time to the right people," Nora said. "There is a county commissioner named Aldrich who has no particular love for Hayes and who has been quietly uncomfortable with Briggs's assessments for the last 3 years. She looked at Thomas. "Aldrich comes through the valley the first week of every month. He stops at Harlow's store because Harlow's wife makes the best coffee in the county, and Aldrich knows it." "Next week," Clara said. Nora looked at her. "Next week," Nora confirmed. Thomas looked between them. "You two," he said, "have been talking." "Women talk," Nora said pleasantly. "About county commissioners," Thomas said. "About everything," Nora said. "That's rather the point." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "What do I say to Aldrich?" he said. "Nothing yet," Clara said. "He needs to come to you, or rather he needs to come to the situation. He can't be approached directly, not by you, not as the man with the complaint, because then it looks like a dispute between neighbors, and Aldrich stays out of neighbor disputes." She paused. "But if the situation comes to him, if the pattern becomes visible to him through multiple sources, through conversations at Harlow's store, through what people in this valley say when they're talking about their own land and their own concerns, he connects the dots himself," Thomas said slowly. "A man who connects dots himself," Clara said, "is a man who acts on what he's decided, not on what he's been told to decide. Hayes can influence a man who's been told. He can't as easily influence a man who's reached his own conclusion." Thomas stared at her. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. Clara looked at him directly. "I learned to survive," she said. "Same as everyone." Nora Howe was watching them with an expression that was carefully neutral and not neutral at all. "I'll talk to May Patterson," Nora said, standing. "She has cousins in town. Aldrich's wife shops at their dry goods store." She looked at Thomas. "You go home and let Clara do what she's been doing, and trust it." Thomas stood. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Nora raised an eyebrow. "You learned manners," she said to him. "I had help," he said. He glanced at Clara. Nora watched that glance. Her expression remained carefully neutral. The week before Assessor Briggs was due to visit was the week the cattle went missing, not 1 or 2, 11 head. Gone from the north pasture overnight fence line clean as a cut not broken cut, which meant tools and intent and a level of boldness that said Hayes had stopped being subtle. Thomas discovered it at dawn. Clara heard him come back into the house, the sound of boots that were moving faster than usual, carrying more weight, and she was already turning from the stove when he came through the door. She looked at his face. "How many?" she said. He told her. She set down what she was holding. "Get Howe," she said. "Get Patterson. Get Sutter, and get the sheriff." "Crawford," Thomas said. The name had a specific weight to it. Not contempt, not trust. Something in between. "I know Crawford is comfortable," Clara said. "I know he's been comfortable for a long time. But 11 cattle is a crime, and it needs to be reported and documented today before anything else moves." She met his eyes. "You document it, Thomas. You document everything. Every missing animal, every cut wire, the positions, the direction of the tracks, everything. And you do it before you do anything else." "I want to." "I know what you want to do," Clara said. "I know exactly what you want to do. And if you do it, Hayes wins. Think about what happens if you go to Hayes's property, angry and without witnesses. Think about what story gets told." He looked at her. His hands were flat at his sides again, open, choosing. "Document it," she said. He went back out. Crawford arrived by mid-morning. He was a heavy-set man with a careful face, and the particular caution of someone who had held a position long enough to know which way every wind blew. He walked the north pasture with Thomas and examined the fence and wrote things in a notebook and said with great precision that he would file a report. "And investigate," Thomas said. "I'll file a report," Crawford said again. Thomas looked at him. "Victor Hayes," Thomas said. Crawford looked at his notebook. "I don't have any evidence pointing to a specific individual," Crawford said. "You have a cut fence line," Thomas said. "You have tracks heading north. You have 11 cattle that walked themselves off my property in the night." "Cattle can break through fences," Crawford said. Thomas said nothing. Crawford closed his notebook. "I'll file the report," he said again, and rode out. And Thomas stood in the north pasture watching him go, and Clara, who had come with Howe, stood beside Thomas, and felt the precise shape of what they were up against. Howe said quietly, "Briggs, Crawford, both of them. He's thorough." "He's been planning this for years," Clara said. "So have we," said a voice behind them. They turned. Patterson and Sutter had ridden up while they were watching Crawford leave. Behind them were 4 more ranchers Clara recognized from the Saturday meetings, and behind those 4 were 2 men she didn't recognize. Patterson said, "The Wright brothers, East Valley. They had their own review 2 years ago, survived it." He looked at Thomas. "They know things." Thomas looked at the group of people on his land. He said, "Come to the house." So, the meeting that afternoon was the largest yet. 12 ranchers around Thomas's table and in his sitting room and spilling into the hallway with Clara and Nora and May Patterson moving through the spaces with coffee and the particular alertness of women who understand that what happens in this room matters. The Wright brothers were a revelation. James Wright was 50 and quiet and had survived his property review because he'd done something nobody else had thought to do. He'd hired a lawyer from Billings, not a local lawyer. A Billings lawyer outside Hayes's reach who had filed documents challenging the assessment methodology and demanded the county produce the specific regulatory standards they were applying to Wright's land. Briggs couldn't produce them, James Wright said, because Hayes had told him what to do, but hadn't told him exactly how to justify it legally. The moment we asked for the legal justification, the whole thing stalled. Silence in the room. "There's a lawyer in Billings," Thomas said slowly. "Name of Franklin," James said. "Good man, expensive, but good. Thomas looked at the table. Clara looked at Thomas. She knew the accounts. She knew what was in them. She knew the cost of the last 2 weeks of work, and the missing cattle, and the daily running of the ranch. She knew what hiring a Billings lawyer would do to those accounts. She also knew that Thomas Callahan would lose this ranch before he admitted he couldn't afford to save it. She said clearly into the quiet, "The cost can be shared." Every head turned. She kept her eyes on Thomas. "If the Valley ranchers are facing the same threat," she said, "then the cost of defending against it can be shared proportionally. Hayes is not coming for Broken Oak alone. He has come for all of you in sequence. Broken Oak is first because it's the most visible." She looked at the other ranchers. "If Broken Oak falls, which of your properties does Hayes move on next? And will you be fighting alone when he does?" Silence. Garrett Howe stood up. "I'll cover a quarter," he said, just like that. Patterson nodded. "An eighth," he said. "And I'll write to Franklin myself. I know his firm." Sutter looked at his son, who nodded. "A quarter between us," Sutter said. Thomas looked around the room. He looked like a man who had been given something he had no experience receiving and no language for accepting. His jaw was working. His eyes were too clear, which meant he was fighting very hard against something. "This is my fight," he said. "Yes," Howe said. "And you'd do the same for any of us. So sit down, Thomas, and stop making this harder than it is." Thomas sat down. Clara looked at her hands on the edge of the table. The letter went to Franklin and Billings that afternoon. By evening, the ranch was quiet again, the visiting horses gone, the table cleared, the children fed, and moving through their evening routines. Clara sat on the back porch with the mending she never seemed to finish, and let the day settle out of her body the way long days needed to settle. Thomas came out. He sat in the other chair. He didn't say anything for a while. "Ben asked me tonight," he said finally, "if you were going to be here when he woke up." Clara looked up. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him yes," Thomas said. He paused. "Was I right?" Clara looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. "You were right." He nodded. He looked at the dark. "He asked if you were going to be here for Christmas," Thomas said. Clara said nothing. "I didn't know what to say to that," he said. "What did you want to say?" Clara asked. A long pause. The night sounds of the valley around them, the distant horses, the wind off the north ridge. "I wanted to say yes," Thomas said, very quietly. "I wanted to say yes to that too." Clara held very still. "Thomas," she said. "I know," he said immediately. "I know. I know what I am, and I know what this situation is, and I'm not asking you anything. He stopped, started again. "I just wanted you to know that what Ben asked is what I would have asked, if I were 4 years old and not afraid of things I can't name." Clara looked at the mending in her hands. "What are you afraid of?" she said softly. "A long beat. That you'll leave," he said. "When the trouble is over, when this is settled and the ranch is safe and there's no reason for you to stay." He looked at her. "I'm afraid that's when you'll realize you came here to survive, and you've survived it, and there's a whole world that isn't this ranch." Clara felt that move through her, the way cold water moves, sudden clarifying, so honest it hurt. She set down the mending. She looked at him directly. "Thomas Callahan," she said, "I left everything I had in Missouri with a bag and $7. I rode a stagecoach across 3 states to a ranch belonging to a man I had never met, who described his 6 children's need for a cook in 4 sentences and could not be bothered to say please." She paused. "I have spent 2 months in this house. I have fixed your kitchen, and your boot, and your fence harness, and your family, and I have stood between you and your own worst impulses twice, and I have sat in the dark with your 4-year-old son, talking to a wooden horse." She held his gaze. "Do I strike you as someone who does those things, temporarily?" Thomas looked at her. He was very still. "No," he said. "No," she agreed. They sat with that. The stars came out above Montana territory, thick and white and extraordinary, exactly the way Ben had described them, like holes in the dark where the light gets through. After a while, Thomas said, "Clara." "Yes," she said. "Whatever happens with Hayes," he said. "Whatever Briggs does, whatever this costs. I need you to know that this ranch and everything on it is worth fighting for. Not because of the land." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Do you?" he said. "Thomas," she said quietly. "I know." He nodded. He looked at the stars. She picked up the mending. They sat there together in the dark, not touching, not naming anything, while the valley breathed around them, and the house at their backs held 6 sleeping children, and the future sat somewhere just ahead of them, unresolved and not yet terrible, waiting to show them what it was made of. She was not afraid. She had been afraid of many things in her life. She had been afraid in Missouri with her dying husband, and she had been afraid on the stagecoach, and she had been afraid walking up to the front gate of Broken Oak Ranch with a bag and $7. She was not afraid now, and she did not yet know that in 6 days the fire would come, and everything she said here on this porch, every quiet word, every honest thing would be tested in the most direct and terrible way possible. She sat in the dark, with the man she was not yet allowing herself to love, and the stars above her, and the house behind her, and she did not know what was coming. She was not afraid. She should have been paying attention to the barn. The smell reached Clara first. She was in bed, not yet fully asleep, lying in that thin border territory between wakefulness and rest, where sounds carry differently, where the body is still, but the mind hasn't fully let go. She had been thinking about Thomas on the porch, about what he'd said, about what she'd said back. Turning it over carefully, the way you turn something fragile checking for cracks. Then the smell came through the window. Wood smoke. She was out of bed before she finished the thought. She crossed to the window and looked out, and what she saw turned her blood to ice water. The barn was lit from inside, not a lamp, not a lantern. A full roaring orange that moved and breathed and pushed light through every gap in the boards like something alive and hungry. She ran. She hit the hallway at full speed, barefoot, one hand slamming against the wall for balance, and she was shouting Thomas's name before she'd made the stairs, and she heard his door open above her, and his feet hit the floor hard, and then she was through the kitchen and out the back door and into the night, and the heat reached her from 30 yards away like a wall. Thomas was right behind her. He came out already pulling on his coat, one boot on, and he saw the barn and made a sound low in his chest that she had never heard from him before. Not fear, not a word. Just the sound a man makes when something he has built with his hands and protected with his life is burning. "The horses," he said. He ran. Clara ran after him, and then stopped because she heard something that stopped her completely. Something underneath the roar of the fire that shouldn't have been there. Something that made every instinct she had turn simultaneously cold and sharp. A child's voice. High and thin and coming from inside the barn. "Ben," she said, out loud. To no one. Just his name the way you say a name when the knowing of it hits you like a physical thing. She ran into the burning barn. The smoke hit her before anything else thick chemical, the kind that didn't just fill the air, but replaced it. She pulled the collar of her nightgown over her face and kept moving and called his name. "Ben. Ben, answer me right now." The horses were screaming somewhere to her left. She could hear Thomas at the far end of the barn, working the stall, latches his voice low and commanding. With the animals, the way it was low and commanding with everything that voice that said, "I am here, and I know what I'm doing, and you can trust that." She moved toward the sound of the child. "Ben," a cough, small, from the right. She dropped low where the air was fractionally clearer, and moved toward it, and found him in the third stall from the front, pressed into the far corner with his wooden horse held against his chest. Both arms wrapped around it. Eyes squeezed shut against the smoke. She grabbed him. He grabbed back both arms, her neck. The horse still somehow in one hand, his face pressed hard against her shoulder. "I got you," she said. "I got you, don't let go." She turned for the door. The roof beam above her cracked. She moved. Pure instinct. She threw herself sideways and forward with Ben against her chest and felt the heat sear across her shoulders as the beam came down behind her, close enough that she felt the rush of displaced air, and then she was moving again fast low toward the rectangle of slightly lighter dark that was the door. They came through it together. Thomas was there. He had gotten the horses out. She could hear them somewhere behind her snorting and stamping, and he had turned back for Ben, and he met Clara at the barn door, and he reached for his son, and Ben transferred to his father's arms without releasing the wooden horse. And Thomas held him so hard and so still that for a moment the three of them were a single shape in the firelight. Clara's hand on Ben's back, Thomas's face buried in his son's hair, both of them breathing. Then Thomas looked at Clara over Ben's head. She had never seen his face like that. She hoped she never saw it again. "You went in," he said. His voice was something she couldn't describe. Not loud. Not anything. "He was in there," she said. Thomas looked at her. His face was absolutely raw. No composure. No flatness. Nothing held back. Just a man looking at a woman who had run into a burning building for his son. "Clara," he said. "He's safe," she said. "Check him." Thomas checked Ben. No burns. Smoke in his lungs, but his cough was clearing. He was still clutching the horse with white-knuckled 4-year-old determination. He was alive. He was unhurt. Thomas pressed his forehead against his son's and held it there for a moment with his eyes closed, and Clara looked away because that was not something she was meant to see, and also because if she didn't look away, she was going to break apart right here in the yard. Behind her, the barn continued to burn. By the time Howe arrived, the structure was lost. Garrett Howe rode in hard 20 minutes after the fire started because Garrett Howe had apparently posted one of his ranch hands to keep an eye on Broken Oak after the cattle went missing, which was the kind of thing Garrett Howe would do without mentioning it, and that hand had seen the glow from the North Ridge and ridden for Howe at a dead run. Howe came through this gate and took in the burning barn, and Thomas standing in the yard with Ben in his arms and Clara behind him, with a burn mark across both shoulders she hadn't felt yet, and he dismounted and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, "Anyone hurt?" "No," Thomas said. Howe looked at Clara, at her shoulders, at the soot on her face and neck. "Clara," he said. "I'm fine," she said. Howe looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at him. Something passed between them that Clara wasn't entirely meant to understand, but understood anyway. The wordless exchange of two men, one telling the other, "This is what happened," and the other receiving it with the full weight it deserved. Howe turned to his hand. "Ride to Patterson," he said. "And Sutter. Tell them to come at first light." He looked at the fire. "We're going to need to talk about what this means." What it meant became clear in the morning. The fire investigator was a man named Cole, who worked for the county and who arrived with Howe's people and Patterson and Sutter, and who walked the remains of the barn with the careful, unhurried attention of someone looking for something specific. He found it. 3 separate points of origin. The kind of pattern that didn't happen accidentally. The kind that required preparation and intent. And someone who knew that a barn fire at night bought time. Time before it was reported. Time before it was investigated. Time during which 11 cattle could disappear, and a property assessment could proceed, and a man who was already exhausted and already grieving and already losing ground could simply decide he had nothing left to fight with. Cole wrote his findings in a report. He did it standing in the yard with Thomas and Howe and Patterson watching him, and when he finished he looked up and said in the flat voice of a professional man stating facts, 3 points of origin, deliberate, accelerant used at each point. This was not an accident. Silence. Thomas said, "Will that go in the official record?" "It's already in the official record," Cole said. He looked at Thomas steadily. "I work for the county, not for Victor Hayes." Howe exhaled. Patterson put his hand on Thomas's shoulder briefly, just to touch a second, then gone the way men did it. Thomas looked at the ruin of his barn. Clara was standing at the edge of the group. She had burns on her shoulders that Nora had dressed that morning with the brisk competence of a woman who had dealt with ranch injuries before, and she had smoke in her lungs that made her breath slightly rough, and she was standing in the morning light watching Thomas look at what was left of the place where she had found his son. He turned and found her in the group without appearing to look for her. He just found her, the way she realized he had been finding her across rooms for weeks. "It ends now," he said. Not to the group, to her. "Yes," she said. "It does." The telegram to Franklin and Billings went out that morning. Not the original letter they'd sent about the assessment. A new communication. One that detailed the fire, Cole's findings, the missing cattle, the damaged fences, the threatening note, Hayes's visit to the property, and the conversation Will Briggs had with Samuel at school. Patterson wrote it because Patterson had the clearest legal mind in the valley, and because his hands were steadier than Thomas's right now, which was understandable, and which Thomas accepted without protest, which told Clara everything about how much Thomas had changed in 2 months. Franklin's reply came the following day. He was coming to the valley. He was bringing documents. And he was bringing something else, the news that Commissioner Aldrich had in fact been at Harlow's store 3 days ago, that he had in fact had conversations with several valley residents, and that he had that same afternoon formally requested a review of Raymond Briggs's last 4 property assessments. Nora Howe read that part of the telegram aloud at the kitchen table. May Patterson made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Clara set down her coffee very carefully. "Nora," she said. "Yes," Nora said. "How long have you been working on Aldrich?" Nora looked at her with perfect innocence. "I have absolutely no idea what you mean," she said. "I simply have coffee with the commissioner's wife every 3rd Thursday, and we talk about whatever comes up." Clara looked at her. Nora looked back. "Women talk," Nora said pleasantly. Thomas, who was sitting at the end of the table, looked at both of them. "God help this valley," he said with something that was unmistakably, definitively a smile. Franklin arrived on Thursday. He was younger than Clara expected, mid-30s, with a quick mind and a manner that suggested he had fought cases larger than this one and had opinions about the people who made such cases necessary. He sat with Thomas and the valley ranchers for 2 hours, and by the end of it, the shape of what they were going to do was as clear and solid as anything Clara had ever watched be built. Franklin would challenge the assessment on procedural grounds, the same strategy that had worked for the Wright brothers, but now backed by Cole's fire report, and the documented pattern of targeted harassment across multiple properties. He would file a formal complaint against Briggs with the county board citing the conflicts of interest Nora's conversations had surfaced. He would request an independent assessment of Broken Oak Ranch by a qualified party with no connection to Hayes or Briggs. And he would do one more thing. "There is a man in Hayes's organization," Franklin said, "named Cord Delaney. He managed the property transfers when Hayes acquired the Larson place and 2 others. I have reason to believe Delaney is not satisfied with his current arrangement with Hayes, and I have reason to believe that if approached correctly, Delaney might be willing to provide documentation of exactly how those arrangements were structured." Thomas looked at him. "You want to turn one of Hayes's own people," Thomas said. "I want to give Delaney the opportunity to protect himself before Hayes's operation becomes too expensive to be worth defending," Franklin said. "Men like Delaney make calculations. When the calculation changes, the loyalty changes." "Can you get to him?" Howe said. "I already have," Franklin said. Silence. Thomas leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the table. He looked at Clara. She looked back steadily. "Do it," he said. The days between Franklin's visit and the county board hearing were the strangest of Clara's time at Broken Oak. The crisis was present, but suspended like weather that had gathered and not yet broken. And in that suspension, the ordinary life of the ranch continued with a vividness that felt almost defiant. Clara cooked. The children went to school. The twins argued about things of spectacular unimportance. Henry left drawings on the table. Samuel came home each day and reported with increasing satisfaction that Will Briggs had stopped talking to him, which Samuel appeared to consider a victory. Ben talked every day now, not only to Clara, to his father, to Emma, to the twins, even cautiously to the visiting ranchers who came and went. He had apparently decided that words were safe again, or perhaps that the people around him were safe enough to offer words to which amounted to the same thing. He had also developed the habit of bringing Clara things. Not just river stones and feathers. He brought her a piece of bark with an interesting pattern, a beetle wing which Clara accepted with complete composure. A yellow wildflower he'd found near the creek, slightly crushed from being carried in a small fist, but still yellow, still a flower. She kept them all. Thomas saw the collection growing on the kitchen windowsill and said nothing. But one morning he came into the kitchen before anyone else was up and placed something on the windowsill beside Ben's offerings. A small piece of carved wood. Clara picked it up. It was a bird. Rough, simple, the kind of thing carved by a man who worked with his hands all day and had used those same hands on something small and careful in the evenings. The wings were not perfect. The head was slightly too large. It was made with obvious effort by someone who did not often make things for their own sake. Clara held it in both hands. Thomas poured his coffee. He did not look at her. "I found the wood near the creek," he said, conversationally, like this was nothing, like he had not spent evenings making this. "It's a bird," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "What kind?" A pause. "The kind that stays," Thomas said. He picked up his coffee and went out to the barn. Clara stood in the kitchen holding a small, rough carved bird that a quiet, proud, difficult, entirely genuine man had made with his hands and left on her windowsill before sunrise. She put it beside the beetle wing and Ben's wildflower. Then she started breakfast. Her hands were not entirely steady. They steadied as she worked. They always steadied as she worked. The county board hearing was set for the last Friday of the month. 2 days before, Cord Delaney signed a sworn statement. Franklin sent word. Thomas read the message at the table with Clara and Howe and Patterson, and what the statement contained was thorough and specific and damning. In the way that only inside knowledge can be damning dates. Amounts. Names the precise mechanics of how Hayes had used Briggs to manufacture the conditions for forced sales. The fire investigator's findings dovetailing with Delaney's account of a conversation he'd personally witnessed between Hayes and 2 men he named who had been paid for specific acts of property damage. Patterson read it twice. "He's finished," Patterson said quietly. Howe looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the statement in his hands. Clara watched his face. She watched the moment it moved through him. Not triumph, because Thomas Callahan was not a man who felt triumph the way smaller men did. What moved through him was something quieter and more complete. The feeling of a man who has held a line long enough to see the pressure release. The feeling of soil under your feet after you've been standing on ice. He set the document down. He looked at Clara. "You told me not to go after him angry," Thomas said. "I did," Clara said. "You told me to be patient." "Yes." "You told me a grove stands." "I did." He held her gaze. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." Clara looked at her coffee cup. "I know," she said. Howe laughed his enormous laugh, the one that made dogs bark. "Lord Almighty," he said. "She sounds like Nora." Thomas's mouth curved. It was the fullest smile she had seen on him. Real and unguarded, and aimed entirely at her, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly, still looking at her. "She does." The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic in the way that things are anticlimactic when the groundwork has been laid so thoroughly that the visible event is merely the last step of something already decided. Franklin presented. Delaney's statement was entered into the record. Cole's fire investigation report was entered. The documentation from 12 Valley ranchers' fence damage, missing cattle threatening communications, was entered as a collective record. Commissioner Aldrich, who had apparently reached his own conclusions with complete independence and no outside influence whatsoever, presided with the particular gravity of a man doing something he had wanted to do for 3 years. Raymond Briggs's assessment of Broken Oak Ranch was invalidated. Briggs himself was suspended, pending a full review of his last 4 years of decisions. Victor Hayes was not in the room. His lawyer was. The lawyer made arguments that Franklin took apart, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had prepared for this and had the documents to support every word. By noon it was over. Thomas came out of the county building into the midday light and stopped on the steps. The Valley ranchers came out around him. Franklin shook hands. Patterson clapped someone on the back. Howe was talking loudly to anyone who would listen. Clara was standing at the bottom of the steps. She had not gone in. It had not been her place to go in. But she had been here since morning, and Thomas had known she was here because he'd looked for her when they arrived, the way he always looked for her, across distances. He came down the steps. He stopped in front of her. "It's done," he said. "I heard," she said. "Broken Oak is safe." "Yes." He looked at her. "Clara," he said. "Thomas," she said. "A beat, 2 beats. I hired you to cook," he said. "You did," she agreed. "You did considerably more than that." "I did what needed doing." He was looking at her with that unguarded expression she was starting to understand was the real Thomas Callahan, not the flat gray of assessment, not the professional distance, but this. This man. The one who carved birds before sunrise and counted his son's sentences and said, "Tell me without resistance." "I don't know how to say what I want to say," he said. "You don't have to say it yet," Clara said. "We have time." He looked at her. "Do we?" he said. Quiet, careful, caring more than the words. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. "We do." He exhaled. He held out his hand. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand open extended in front of her. Waiting. She looked at it. She placed her hand in it. He closed his fingers around hers. Not tight, not possessive, just present, just the warmth of one person's hand around another's, holding on. They stood there on the steps of the county building in the noonday light, with the Valley ranchers moving around them, and the world going about its ordinary business, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say that the hands weren't already saying better. Garrett Howe walked past them, looked down at their joined hands, and kept walking. Behind him, without looking back, he said, "About time." Thomas did not release her hand. Clara looked at the valley spread out before them. The mountains on 3 sides, the pale gold grass, the sky that went on forever above Montana territory. She thought about a stagecoach, about a bag, about $7.43, and a letter offering work. She thought about the ground and how she had learned to trust it only by testing each step and how it had held her every time. It was holding her now. She tightened her fingers slightly in his. He held on. They rode home from the county building in a group, Howe and Nora Patterson Sutter and his son Franklin, who had agreed to stay one more night before returning to Billings, and the ride back felt different from every ride that had come before it. Looser, lighter. The particular lightness of people who have been braced against something for so long that when it finally releases, the body doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of pressure. Thomas rode beside Clara. He didn't say much. He rarely said much, but he rode beside her, not ahead of her the way he usually did when they were out together, not at the professional distance of an employer, but beside her close enough that their horses occasionally drifted together and corrected, and he didn't correct further than that. Clara noticed. She noticed everything. When they came through the gate of Broken Oak Ranch, all 6 children were on the porch. Emma had brought them out. Clara understood immediately that Emma had understood what the hearing meant, and had made a decision, the kind of decision a 13-year-old girl makes when she has been a second mother long enough to understand that moments need to be honored, that some things deserve to be witnessed properly. They were all there. Emma with her arms crossed and her chin up, trying not to show what her eyes were showing. the twins side by side vibrating with the energy of children who have been waiting for something and are not entirely sure what. Samuel standing slightly apart with his hands in his pockets, doing his best to look like he hadn't been watching the road for the last 2 hours. Henry beside him present in a way Henry sometimes wasn't, his eyes clear and focused and here. And Ben at the front of the porch, wooden horse in both arms, looking at his father with an expression that had no complicated layers to it at all. Just a 4-year-old boy looking at his father coming home. Thomas dismounted. He walked to the porch. He picked Ben up, horse and all, and held him against his chest, and Ben put both arms around his father's neck, and they stayed like that for a moment, while the rest of the world conducted its business around them. Then Thomas looked up at Emma. Emma looked back at him.
"It's over," she said.
"It's over," Thomas said. Emma's jaw worked once. Then she turned around and walked back into the house, and Clara heard through the porch wall, through the kitchen door, through the ordinary sounds of a ranch at midday, the sound of Emma Callahan sitting down at the kitchen table and crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just finally. Just the specific sound of someone who has held something for a very long time and has been given permission to put it down. Clara went inside. She sat beside Emma and did not say anything, and did not put her arm around her, and did not make it a moment, because Emma would not want it to be a moment. She just sat there, present the way she had always been present, and after a while, Emma's breathing steadied, and she wiped her face with the back of her hand and said without looking at Clara, "Don't tell Samuel." "Tell him what?" Clara said. Emma looked at her. Something in her expression shifted into something that was almost a smile. "Thank you," Emma said, quietly, with everything she had. Clara looked at her hands on the table. "Don't thank me," she said. "This family did this. You did this. Every one of you held this together long enough for it to matter." "You helped," Emma said. "A little," Clara said. "More than a little," Emma said. She looked at the table. "I didn't want you here when you came. I need you to know that. I thought you'd be like the others. I thought you'd last 11 days and leave." "I know," Clara said. "I'm glad I was wrong," Emma said. Very direct, the way Emma did everything. Clara looked at her. "So am I," she said. That evening was the best evening Broken Oak Ranch had seen since before Margaret Callahan died. Clara knew it while it was happening, which was rare. Usually you only recognize the best evenings from the other side of them in memory when they'd already passed. But this one she felt in real time, every minute of it, like something precious being handed to her while her hands were open. Nora Howe stayed and helped with supper. May Patterson came with her husband. Franklin sat at the end of the table and turned out to have an unexpectedly good sense of humor that Thomas met with something Clara hadn't heard from him before, a real, full, unguarded laugh. Not the almost smile, not the breath that wanted to be laughter. A real one. It was the most beautiful sound she'd heard in a long time. The twins made it their personal mission to make Franklin laugh again, at least 3 more times, which they achieved through methods of escalating audacity. Samuel talked to Sutter's son about horses with the focused intensity of a boy who had been waiting for a real conversation and had finally found one. Henry drew quietly at the edge of the table and at some point passed a sketch to Franklin, who looked at it and then looked at Henry with genuine surprise and said, "Son, this is extraordinary." And Henry said, "I know," with complete simple honesty, and the table erupted. Ben sat on Thomas's left. The empty chair was Thomas's right, where Margaret had sat, and no one had filled it all these months. Clara sat across from Thomas between Emma and Nora, and Ben ate his supper with Buck on his lap under the table, and contributed to the conversation periodically with statements of complete seriousness that stopped the table cold every time. At one point, during a lull, Ben looked up at Clara across the table. "Buck says this is a good night," he announced. "Buck is right," Clara said. Ben nodded satisfied and went back to his stew. Thomas across the table was looking at Clara with that open, unguarded expression. She met his eyes. She looked away first because she had to look somewhere, and she chose her stew, and she was absolutely certain that Nora Howe, sitting beside her, noticed every syllable of that exchange and filed it away with the efficiency of a woman who noticed everything. Sure enough, Nora leaned close and said under the cover of the general noise, "Clara?" "Don't," Clara said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Nora said in the tone of a woman who was absolutely going to say something. "Nora," Clara said. "He carved you a bird," Nora said. Clara kept her eyes on her stew. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "It's on your windowsill," Nora said. "I noticed it this morning, next to a beetle wing and a crushed wildflower." "Those are Ben's," Clara said. "The bird isn't," Nora said. Clara said nothing. Nora patted her hand once the way she always did, brisk, efficient, final. "Good," she said, and returned to her supper. The twist came after dinner, when the guests were gone and the children were in bed, and Clara was doing what she always did, the last work of the day, the quiet maintenance that kept the house running, the mending and the banking of the stove, and the wiping down of surfaces. Thomas came in. He sat at the table. He put a piece of paper on it. Clara looked at him. He nodded at the paper. She came and picked it up. It was a letter. From a woman named Ruth Whitfield, Daniel's sister. Clara's sister-in-law, who she had not heard from since the funeral, who had made it clear in the months following Daniel's death that she considered Clara's departure from Missouri a kind of abandonment, not just of the state, but of Daniel's memory of the family connection of something Ruth apparently felt belonged to her. The letter had been forwarded 3 times, postmarked 2 weeks ago. It had arrived today of all days, which was the kind of timing that felt like something. Clara read it standing at the table. Thomas watched her face. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "Ruth wants me to come back," she said. "She says my place is in Missouri. She says—" She stopped. "She says a woman who leaves her grief behind is a woman who never truly loved her husband." Silence. Thomas said nothing. "She says this situation," Clara gestured at the house around her, at everything it represented, "is a betrayal of Daniel's memory." Thomas was very still. Clara looked at the letter. "She knew Daniel longer than I did," Clara said quietly. "She loved him. She's in pain, and she's directing it at the nearest available target, which is me, which is something grief does to people. I know that." She paused. "I'm not angry at her." "What are you?" Thomas said. Clara picked up the letter. She folded it carefully. She set it on the table between them. "Daniel would have liked you," she said. "That's the first thing I thought when I read it. I thought Daniel would have liked this man. He would have liked this ranch. He would have liked the children." She looked at Thomas directly. "He spent 6 years making sure I knew I was capable of more than I believed I was. He fixed things. He read out loud. He brought me wildflowers." Her voice stayed even. "He would not have wanted me to spend the rest of my life apologizing for surviving him." Thomas looked at her. "Clara," he said. "I'm not going back to Missouri," she said. "I need you to know that. Whatever happens or doesn't happen, I am not going back. This is where I am. This is where I choose to be." Thomas stood up. He was on the other side of the table, and then he wasn't. He came around it with the deliberate directness of a man who has finished thinking and started deciding, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her with everything he had. No gray flatness, no professional distance, nothing managed or controlled. "I have been trying," he said, "to find the right time and the right words for something I want to say." Clara looked at him. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I know," she said. "Margaret used to say I communicated better with fence posts than with people." "She wasn't wrong," Clara said. His mouth moved. The real smile, the one she had seen on the courthouse steps and wanted to keep. "I know," he said. "But I'm going to say it anyway because Ben asked me last night if you were going to be his mother, and I told him that was a question I needed to ask you first." Clara went absolutely still. "He's 4, Thomas said. "He asked it the way 4-year-olds ask things, straight out, no ceremony." He paused. He said, and I am telling you his exact words, he said, Papa, can Clara be our mother? Buck thinks she already is. Something happened to Clara's face that she couldn't stop. Thomas looked at her. I told him Buck had good instincts, Thomas said quietly. And then I told him I needed to ask you a question first. Thomas, Clara said. I am not the easiest man, he said. I know that. I've got 6 children, and a rebuilt barn, and a ranch that tried very hard to fall apart. And an entire valley of neighbors who now apparently feel comfortable dropping by at any time for any reason. He paused. I have very little to offer except the fact that this place is yours as much as it's mine, and it has been since about the 3rd week you were here, and I have been too proud and too afraid to say so. Clara looked at him. That is not very little, she said. I love you, Thomas said, like it was the simplest sentence he'd ever said. Like it was a fence post thing, a practical thing, a thing that was just true and required stating. I didn't plan to. I wouldn't have said it was something I had available anymore, but there it is. Clara reached out and picked up the small carved bird from the windowsill. She turned it in her hands. She looked at the too large head, and the imperfect wings, and the evidence of evenings spent making something for its own sake by a man who rarely did anything for its own sake. She set it down. She looked at Thomas Callahan. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, to which part, he said. All of it, she said. Every part. He reached up and touched her face, just his hand against her cheek, rough and warm, the hand of a man who had built everything around him with those hands. And she leaned into it, the way you lean into something you've been moving toward for a long time without knowing you were moving. He pressed his forehead to hers. They stood like that in the kitchen with the lamp between them and the house around them, and outside the window, the Montana stars doing what Ben said they did, burning through the dark, like something that couldn't be kept out. They were married on the first Saturday of the following spring. No courthouse, no fanfare. Just the valley, and the people in it, and the old cottonwood tree in the yard where Clara had sat so many evenings watching the children play. Reverend Miles came from town. He was a small man with a gentle manner who had baptized 4 of the Callahan children and buried Margaret Callahan, and who looked at Thomas and Clara standing under the cottonwood and appeared to feel that the circle had closed the way circles were meant to. Nora Howe cried, which she did not admit and which Clara did not mention. Garrett Howe did not cry. He laughed instead loudly and genuinely at everything that happened, which was his way of expressing the same thing. Patterson shook Thomas's hand for a long time. May Patterson hugged Clara and whispered, You saved this valley, you know. Not just this ranch, all of it. Clara pulled back and looked at her. The valley saved itself, she said. It just needed someone to remind it that it could. Emma stood beside Clara through the whole ceremony. Not behind her, not across from her. Beside. She had asked quietly 2 days before if she could, and Clara had said yes immediately, and Emma had nodded and walked away, and not made it a moment, because that was how Emma did things. But she was there, right beside Clara. And when Reverend Miles asked if anyone had reason why these 2 should not be joined, and there was the traditional silence, Emma reached out and took Clara's hand, just for a moment. Then she released it. But Clara felt it for the rest of the day. The twins threw flower petals with aggressive enthusiasm and managed to hit Reverend Miles directly in the face twice, for which they apologized with the sincerity of people who were not particularly sorry. Samuel shook Thomas's hand after the ceremony man to man, and Thomas gripped it and held it for an extra second, and they looked at each other, and Samuel nodded once, and that was everything that needed to be said between them. Henry gave Clara a drawing folded into a small square. She opened it later when the guests had gone and the yard was quiet. It was the kitchen table again, the same drawing he'd given her months ago. But this time, the figure at the end of the table wasn't an aproned stranger. He'd written one word under it. Mom. Clara folded it back up. She put it in the pocket over her heart. She left it there for the rest of the day. Ben presented Buck to Clara during the reception. Formally, with both hands the way you offer something sacred. You can hold him, Ben said. Clara took the wooden horse with both hands. She looked at it carefully, the repaired leg, the paint worn away in the places Ben held it. Most the small, perfect weight of something carried by love for so long, it had absorbed it. Thank you, she said, and meant it the way you mean things that go deeper than words. Ben took the horse back. He looked at it. Then he looked at Clara. Buck says you're ours now, Ben said. Clara looked at this small boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's place in the world, and a wooden horse that held everything he'd loved and lost and kept. Buck is right, she said. I am. Years later, when people in the valley talked about Clara Callahan, and they did, because some people become part of a place so thoroughly that the place tells their story long after they've stopped needing to tell it themselves. They didn't talk about the fire, though they knew about the fire. They didn't talk about Victor Hayes or Raymond Briggs or the county hearing, though they knew about those too. What they talked about was smaller than that. They talked about the way the Broken Oak Ranch changed. Not just the rebuilt barn or the recovered cattle or the documented fences. The way it felt when you rode up to it. The way the children turned out. The way Thomas Callahan, who had been a man disappearing into his own grief, came back to himself and came back to his valley and started being the kind of neighbor other men wanted to be. They said it was Clara who did that. Clara, if she heard it, always said the same thing. Thomas did that. The children did that. I just cooked the meals. And Nora Howe, who was usually nearby when Clara said it, would look at Clara with that small, knowing smile and say nothing, because Nora had always understood, that the woman who cooks the meals and keeps the kitchen warm and sits beside the child in the dark and holds the line. When the line needs holding is not a woman who just does anything. She is the woman who makes everything else possible. She is the center that holds. Clara Whitfield had come to Broken Oak Ranch with one bag, $7, and a letter offering work. She left nothing. She stayed. And the family that formed around her kitchen table, the girl who learned to be a child again, the twins who filled every room they entered, the boy who came back from his silence, the dreamer who drew the world. He saw the careful son who learned that strength could ask for help. That family was the truest thing Clara ever built, not because she planned it, not because she was looking for it, but because she was willing to stay long enough for it to become real. Some people are born into their families. Clara Callahan earned hers. One meal at a time. One morning at a time. One hand held in the dark at a time, until the holding became permanent, until the staying became forever, until the woman who arrived with nothing discovered that she had, without quite noticing, become everything to the people who needed her most. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. That is the only thing that has ever mattered.